You ever feel like you just don't quite fit in? Like, no matter where you go, something feels off. Well, that's kind of the vibe we're diving into today. We're going to explore the later life of King David and how he organized the temple in 1 Chronicles, from priests and Levites to musicians, gatekeepers, and even the way he handed everything over to his son Solomon. We're going to take a look from a big picture perspective without getting lost in the crazy long lists of names. So, let's jump in. Alright, so let's start with the priesthood. Now, back in David's day, the Levitical priesthood was a really big deal. These were the folks who were set apart to serve God in very specific ways. Sacrifices, rituals, worship, that whole scene. And here's a fun little connection. John the Baptist. Yeah, the guy who shows up in the New Testament baptizing people and preparing the way for Jesus, he actually comes from this priestly line. His dad, Zechariah, was a descendant of Abijah, one of the priests from David's time. And that's kind of fascinating because it shows this continuity. God's work and his plans are long game stuff, stretching across generations. You see, John stepping up wasn't just a random thing. He was part of this legacy that started way back in the Old Testament. Now, I know sometimes when people hear all this priest talk, they might think, oh man, that's all about rules and rituals. Super complicated, and yeah, it kinda was. But there's a deeper point here. See, the priesthood back then was necessary. People couldn't just walk up to God themselves. They needed an intercessor, someone who could go into the holy place, perform the sacrifices, and represent them before God. And David, like any king, would have recognized that this system was crucial. It's part of the structure of worship that God had established. But here's the twist, and this is where it gets exciting. Jesus comes along and flips the whole system on its head. Because Jesus becomes the ultimate high priest. No more human middlemen. No more waiting in line. No worrying if you got the ritual just right. He intercedes for everyone, once and for all. And it's kind of mind-blowing if you think about it. All those generations of priests, all those sacrifices, they pointed to Jesus. And then suddenly, there he is, the one who ever lives to make intercession for us. You don't need to confess your daily mess to a human priest. And honestly, wouldn't that be kind of awkward anyway? I mean, your pastor probably doesn't need the full play-by-play of your week. We all have our stuff, right? But Jesus, he handles it. He's the perfect intercessor. No judgment, no gossip, just perfect loving representation before God. And here's something I love. Think about the relief that must have brought to people. For centuries, they were bound by the priestly system, rituals, and strict rules, and now, in the New Testament, all of that points to this incredible gift, a direct line to God through Jesus. It's almost like God was saying, I've got this. I set it up perfectly, and now I'm bringing it full circle. And it's also kind of funny, right? Because some folks coming out of Catholic traditions would still call a pastor or a priest father, and well, that's not exactly the point anymore. David's priestly descendants would have understood the importance of their role, but now we have Jesus, our one and only high priest. So we can just take it all straight to him. And isn't that kind of freeing? Also, this shows the continuity and faithfulness of God. He doesn't just start and stop with David. He works through generations, through specific lines, like the line of Abijah, to accomplish his purposes. And yet, he always points forward. Every priest, every ritual, every song, they were all setting the stage for something bigger. And that bigger thing is Jesus. That's why when you read Luke chapter 1 and you see the angel Gabriel visiting Zechariah, it hits different. You can see the thread from David's temple organization right down to the birth of John the Baptist. God's plan has depth and foresight that's just wild if you think about it. So, bottom line, David organizes, the Levites serve. John shows up, and Jesus ultimately takes the throne as the eternal high priest. And the shift here isn't just procedural, it's personal. It's like going from having someone else handle your mail to being able to go straight to the CEO yourself. And in this case, the CEO loves you and wants to hear from you directly. No middleman, no awkward explanations, just a direct connection. That's the beauty of it. It's a massive leap from the Old Testament priesthood to the New Testament reality of Jesus. And it's a game changer for anyone trying to understand how God connects with his people. Okay, so here's where things get really interesting with David. Now, you might think, well, David was king. He can do anything. But here's the thing. David couldn't actually build the temple himself. His hands were, well, let's just say, a little too bloodied from all the wars he'd fought. Yeah, not exactly temple building material, but David wasn't just going to shrug and say, well, guess someone else will figure it out. Nope. Instead, he went full organizer mode and started gathering all the resources he could possibly need. We're talking gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, stone. He basically stockpiled everything that could possibly go into the temple. And then he recruited all the laborers. So even if he couldn't lay a single stone, he made sure that everything was ready for the person who could, his son Solomon. But David didn't stop at just gathering resources. He went a level deeper. He organized the people who would serve in the temple. This is where the structure of service really shines in 1 Chronicles. You've got priests, who are of course part of the Levitical tribe, tasked with performing the sacred duties, handling sacrifices, and doing the rituals that were central to worship. Then you've got the rest of the tribe of Levi, and they're assigned as singers, musicians, worship leaders, and even gatekeepers. Each person has a specific role, and the organization is surprisingly meticulous. Now, don't get intimidated by the names. Yes, the text lists a ton of them, but we're going to look at this from about 30,000 feet, so you get the idea without your brain melting. Chapter 25 of 1 Chronicles is where the musicians come in. David and the military captain separated some of the sons of Asaph. He-Man and Jeduthun, yeah, those are their names. And yes, He-Man totally sounds like an action figure, right? To prophesy with harps, stringed instruments, and cymbals. And get this, these guys weren't just randomly picked, they were highly skilled. Verse 6 mentions 288 of them in total, casting lots for their duties, making sure that both the small and the great, the teacher and the student, had a place in the service of the Lord. David's heart here is so clear. He's a worshiper at heart. I mean, the guy wrote a huge chunk of the Psalms, so arranging musicians wasn't just paperwork for him, it was deeply personal and spiritual. Worship was central to his life, and he wanted the temple to reflect that. Now, let's talk about He-Man for a second. He is referred to as the king's seer, and here's where a lot of people get confused. What's a seer, and how is that different from a prophet? Well, both prophets and seers receive divine inspiration, but the way they get it differs. A prophet usually receives a message from God, kind of like a word of knowledge today, and communicates that to the people. A seer, on the other hand, receives visions or sometimes dreams. He sees things in a way that's inspired by God and then shares them. Think of it as prophets speaking, seers showing. The word seer isn't used in the New Testament, even though people still have visions, like Paul's vision of heaven in 2 Corinthians 12, or Stephen seeing Jesus during his martyrdom in Acts 7, or John on Patmos. So, seer as a term is Old Testament specific, but the concept carries through in examples of divine revelation. Anyway, back to the temple organization. Each musician and worshiper was under the direction of their father, who guided their service in the house of the Lord. David even organized the divisions of the Levites for music and worship so that everything had order. And it wasn't just about the music sounding good, it was about structuring the worship in a way that honored God and allowed the people to participate meaningfully. This was intentional, and it came from the heart of a worshiper who wanted to see God glorified through music and service. And really, it shows how David's personal devotion to worship shaped the way the temple functioned. What's fascinating is the level of planning. You've got the priests handling the sacred duties, the Levites leading music and worship, and even divisions for gatekeeping, which we'll get into later, but all of it is coordinated. And here's a little insight into casting lots, which might sound weird today. For assigning duties, they sometimes cast lots as a way to discern God's will. Not like flipping a coin in Vegas, but more like a spiritually guided system to make sure assignments were fair and divinely directed. It's like David was saying, I'm doing my best to organize everything, and God, you guide us in this. David's leadership here is kind of remarkable because it blends the spiritual with the practical. He's not just a king issuing orders, he's deeply invested in worship, in the hearts of the people, and in making sure God's house is properly cared for. That's why he takes the time to sort out musicians, assign responsibilities, and even note the lineage and roles of specific families. It's almost like he's setting up a template for worship that will continue for generations. And it's personal, too. He's a former shepherd, a man who spent his early years playing music and singing to God before he was a warrior, before he was a king. That background as a worshiper shapes the way he organizes the temple. You can see it in how intentional he is about every role having a purpose. Every person contributing to the glory of God. And humor me here because I love this little detail. He-Man, King Seer. Just the name alone makes you think of a heroic action figure, right? But beyond the funny name, it's a serious role. He-Man and his children were key in ensuring worship and divine guidance were properly implemented, and it underscores how God worked through families and lineages to carry out his purposes, giving structure and continuity to worship. These weren't random appointments. They were carefully considered, inspired by God, and organized by a king who truly loved worship. So, to sum it up, even though David couldn't build the temple himself, he essentially set the entire operation in motion. He gathered all the resources, recruited the workforce, and organized the people who would serve in worship. From priests performing sacred duties, to Levites leading music, to musicians prophesying with instruments under the direction of their fathers, and even seers providing spiritual insight. David created a framework that allowed worship to thrive and God's house to be properly honored. And throughout all of it, you can see his heart. David was a worshiper first and a king second. That's what makes this so compelling. It's a masterclass in leadership, devotion, and organizing for God's glory, with just the right mix of divine inspiration and practical planning. Alright, let's talk about the gatekeepers. Now, when you hear the word gatekeeper, you might imagine some medieval knight with a big sword standing at a castle gate. And, well, you wouldn't be entirely wrong, but in the context of the temple, it was a little more nuanced than that. Gatekeepers had a pretty important job. They welcomed people into the temple and, at the same time, made sure everything stayed safe and orderly. Think of them as a mix between ushers, security guards, and the people who politely tell you not to bring coffee into a museum. Seriously, the gatekeepers were there to maintain both decorum and protection. They weren't just standing around for fun, they were literally the first line of defense for God's house. They'd watch over who came in, making sure nothing improper was happening. And they'd also ensure that the temple remained a sacred space. And imagine them standing there, people walking in with all sorts of stuff. Maybe someone's trying to sneak in a snack or a beverage, and the gatekeeper has to go. Nope, sorry, that's not allowed. Kind of like modern ushers at a theater saying, "Sir, that popcorn bag is too big," and "Ma'am, no outside drinks." It's funny to think about, but the principle is the same. They had to protect the sanctity of the space. And here's something else that's fascinating. God was involved even in the specifics of who went to which gate. They didn't just pick names out of a hat randomly. There was a system, and it was divinely guided. They used a process called casting lots to assign gatekeepers to specific gates. Now, before anyone thinks they were literally rolling dice like in Vegas, casting lots was more like a spiritual lottery. It was a method inspired by God to make fair and just assignments. The priests would have these two stones, the Urim and Thummim, embedded in their garments. And through them, God would reveal his will. One stone might indicate a yes, the other a no. And through this process, they discerned the right placement for each gatekeeper, so it was all orderly, divinely guided, and not left to human whim. Verse 12 of chapter 26 in 1 Chronicles explains it nicely. The gatekeepers were assigned to various gates by lots, both small and great, according to their father's house. And that's really cool because it shows that God cares about details. Even who stands at the east gate versus the west gate, God had a hand in that. and the text gives a clear breakdown. 6 Levites on the east, 4 on the north each day, 4 on the south, and 2 by 2 for the storehouse. There's also a mention of the parbar, which is thought to be like a colonnade area or courtyard extending from the temple. The divisions are precise, and the responsibility is serious, but the way it's described, you can also imagine the personalities, right? Some of these guys were probably the sticklers, keeping everyone in line, while others were friendlier, welcoming visitors with a smile. And it's easy to make a modern comparison. Today, at a church or big event, you've got ushers who greet people, hand out programs, and gently guide folks to their seats. You've got security personnel keeping the event safe. In the temple, the gatekeepers did both at the same time. They had to make sure the house of the Lord remained holy and that the people entering were treated respectfully. They were the first point of contact for worshipers, setting the tone for their experience. And just like modern ushers, some of their work might have been a little mundane, checking that nothing prohibited came in, but the impact was significant because it helped maintain the sacredness of the temple. There's a funny little side note here that the narrator often mentions. Think about someone sneaking coffee into the temple. You know how it goes, right? People try to be clever, bringing it in a travel mug or a thermos, pretending it's water. The gatekeepers would know, of course. We see you, we know it's coffee. Put it down. It's a humorous image, but it helps illustrate the point. Their job was not just security, it was about respect and order. They maintained the spiritual environment by being attentive, sometimes strict, sometimes welcoming, but always responsible. Now, let's connect this to the broader picture of David's organization. The gatekeepers weren't working in isolation. They were part of a carefully planned system. David, inspired by God, assigned roles to priests, Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, making sure the temple functioned smoothly. Casting lots, as we mentioned, ensured divine guidance and assignments, creating a balance between human responsibility and God's oversight. This wasn't just a bureaucratic exercise. It was about establishing a temple that honored God and facilitated worship in an orderly, respectful way. And here's something really fascinating. Even though the New Testament doesn't have this exact system anymore, the principles still resonate. We still have leaders, ushers, security, and coordinators in churches today. The way God orchestrated the temple setup shows his care for structure, community, and worship. Every gatekeeper had a purpose, every assignment had meaning, and God's hand was evident in all the details. And we can smile a little at the human element, imagining them enforcing rules like no coffee spills, while still taking their spiritual responsibilities very seriously. So, to wrap up this part, gatekeepers were more than just guards. They were the first line of hospitality, protection, and order for God's house. They guided worshipers, kept the temple safe, and ensured that every visitor respected the sacred space. Assignments were made through divinely guided casting of lots, showing God's involvement in even the small details. And while we can chuckle at some of the modern comparisons, think ushers, security, and coffee mishaps, their role was vital, blending spiritual responsibility with practical oversight. David's careful organization of the temple personnel, including these gatekeepers, reflects both the order and devotion that defined his reign and set a standard for worship that carried through generations. Alright, so now we get into the part where David isn't just organizing priests, Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, but also handling the more practical stuff, treasuries, spoils, and the military divisions responsible for the temple. And trust me, this is where the meticulous nature of David's leadership really shines. So, let's break it down. First off, the treasuries. David assigned specific Levites to be in charge of the treasuries of the house of God and the treasuries of the dedicated things. Think of it like this. These guys were the CFOs and accountants of the temple. All the donations, offerings, and even items dedicated from spoils of war, David wanted to make sure it was managed properly. Why? Because this was God's house, and stewardship mattered big time. And it wasn't just any casual bookkeeping. It had to be organized, accounted for, and safeguarded. It's kind of like today when a church or organization has to carefully manage donations, tithes, and special funds. One mistake, and things could get messy. So David set up systems and assigned responsible Levites to ensure everything was in order. Speaking of spoils of war, that's the next interesting piece. Remember, in those days, victories in battle often brought back spoils: gold, silver, livestock, all sorts of resources. Instead of letting it all just sit around or get divided haphazardly, David dedicated some of these spoils specifically to the upkeep of the temple. So, if you think about it, the temple had its own funding system, partly from offerings of the people, but also from these dedicated spoils. It's a smart system when you consider it. The temple wasn't just spiritual center, but a hub that needed resources, and David made sure the finances and supplies were sustainable. Now, let's get to the military divisions guarding the temple. And yes, this part involves some fun math. David divided the army into 12 divisions specifically tasked with guarding the temple. Each division had 24,000 soldiers, and they rotated monthly. So, 24,000 soldiers per division times 12 divisions, that's 288,000 soldiers overall. Imagine that for a second. Almost 300,000 people, all organized to ensure that the temple, the sacred place of worship, stayed secure. It's not just numbers, though it's planning, coordination, and oversight. Each division served for 1 month, then rotated out, making sure no division was overworked and that the temple was continuously protected. And these weren't just random groups of men. Each division had assigned captains, heads of fathers' houses, officers of thousands and hundreds, all serving the king in every matter of the military divisions. It's fascinating because David wasn't just throwing numbers at a problem, he was systematically assigning people to roles that matched their capabilities and responsibilities. There was oversight at every level, and the rotation ensured fairness and efficiency. And when you look at the numbers, it's impressive, right? 24,000 each month, 12 months. David essentially had a full year calendar covered, with constant temple security. It's logistics on a level that most of us can barely imagine, but David handled it like a pro. Now, alongside military oversight, David also had officials managing the king's property, which included agricultural assets, livestock, and other resources. And let me just say, reading through this list is a little amusing, because it's like a biblical version of cabinet officials or department heads. You've got one guy over the fields, another over vineyards, one in charge of olive trees, another over herds, someone else overseeing camels, donkeys, and even donkeys. Yes, donkeys. Each person had a specific domain, and their responsibility was to ensure the king's property was well managed and productive. It's almost like reading a modern organizational chart, and you can't help but picture these officials going about their day, clipboard in hand, making sure the crops, livestock, and treasures were all in top shape. And of course, some of the names are familiar. Ahihel, for instance, was a king's counselor. He was originally a close friend and advisor to David, but as life goes, and in this case, due to the fallout from David's sin with Bathsheba and the later rebellion of Absalom, Ahihel became a tragic figure. It's a reminder that even in a perfectly organized system, human relationships and emotions still play a role. Life, leadership, and management aren't just about efficiency, they're about people. And David had to navigate that alongside all the planning and spiritual considerations. Anyway, back to the organization. David's approach shows a masterclass in combining spiritual purpose with practical logistics. The temple wasn't just a religious site, it required careful administration. Assigning Levites to treasuries, using spoils for maintenance, organizing massive military divisions, and appointing officials to oversee every aspect of the king's property. It's a combination of faith, leadership, and practical wisdom. David had to balance the sacred and the practical, ensuring that the temple could function smoothly, be protected, and remain a place where people could come to worship God. And let's talk briefly about how inspiring this is. David's level of detail shows that he cared deeply about God's house. This wasn't bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy. It was devotion expressed through meticulous planning, music, worship, priestly duties, gatekeepers, treasuries, military protection. Every single piece of this puzzle reflected the priority of honoring God and creating a space that facilitated worship. And the fact that he included dedicated resources from spoils of war shows his foresight. He knew the temple needed ongoing support, and he put systems in place to ensure it could thrive long after he was gone. Plus, thinking about those 288,000 soldiers rotating monthly is mind-blowing. Each group had a clear schedule, responsibilities, and oversight. It's like a modern-day rotation system, but way more complex because of the spiritual significance, the logistics of ancient armies, and the need for divine guidance and assignments. And it wasn't just for show. This was about protecting a sacred space, ensuring safety, and supporting worship. David clearly understood that God's work required both spiritual devotion and practical action. He combined the heart of a worshiper with the mind of an organizer, and the result is a blueprint that ensured the temple would function efficiently, honorably, and safely. And that's what makes this section so fascinating. We see David balancing all these layers: spiritual leadership, practical management, military organization, and resource oversight. He's not just a king giving orders, he's a servant of God, ensuring that the temple operates smoothly and that every person involved has a clear role. And the math, the planning, the delegation, it's all part of honoring God in a very tangible way. The soldiers guarding the temple, the Levites managing treasuries, the officials overseeing property, and the use of spoils for upkeep. It all comes together to show a perfectly coordinated system designed to glorify God while serving the people. So, in a nutshell, David's handling of the treasuries, the spoils, and the military divisions reveals a man who understood both devotion and logistics. He made sure God's house was well-funded, well-guarded, and organized. He appointed capable individuals to oversee property, resources, and personnel, and he did it all with an eye toward both spiritual significance and practical sustainability. It's a beautiful example of how leadership, faith, and planning can come together to serve God's purposes in a big, impactful way. Okay, now we get to one of the most pivotal moments in this whole story, David handing over everything to his son Solomon. And you've got to picture this scene. David, older now, knowing his time is limited, calling together all the leaders of Israel. We're talking officers of the tribes, captains of divisions, stewards over the king's possessions, valiant men, and all the mighty warriors. It's like a full assembly of the kingdom's top brass. And David stands up and gives this speech, but not just any speech. This is heavy, heartfelt, and strategic all at once. David starts by acknowledging his own heart's desire. He says, "I wanted to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, for the footstool of our God." He had made preparations, gathered materials, planned it all out, but God told him, "You won't build this temple because you've shed blood." And here's where the spiritual wisdom comes in. David could have been bitter or disappointed, but instead, he focuses on the bigger picture. God still chose him to lead, still chose his lineage, and most importantly, chose his son Solomon to take the baton. It's a lesson in trusting God's plan, even when it doesn't match our own. So, David tells the leaders of Israel about Solomon, that God has specifically chosen him to sit on the throne and to build the temple. Now, Solomon is young, maybe around 19 or 20, but God's choice isn't about age or experience. It's about the heart and the divine plan. And David emphasizes that to Solomon. Know the God of your father and serve him with a loyal heart and willing mind. He will be with you. Don't fear. I love this because it's both fatherly advice and spiritual encouragement. It's like David is saying, "Son, you might be young, you might feel inexperienced, but God's got this, and I've got your back in every way I can." Then comes the incredible part, the handoff of the temple plans and resources. David literally gives Solomon every detail of the temple's design. We're talking the vestibule, the houses, the treasuries, the upper and inner chambers, and even the place of the mercy seat. And all of this wasn't just David's idea. God himself had given these plans by the Spirit. So it's not just practical, it's deeply spiritual. It's like passing on a sacred blueprint, not just architectural instructions, but God-inspired guidance for how his house should function and be honored. And then there's the matter of resources. David had collected mountains of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and precious stones over the years, and he carefully allocates everything for the construction of the temple. He literally gives Solomon gold by weight for the lampstands, tables, forks, basins, altars, chariots, and cherubim. Silver, too, for everything that needed it. It's mind-boggling how thorough this was. Every single item, every piece of precious metal, every vessel, every instrument, it's all accounted for. And again, it's not just about material wealth. It's about stewardship and ensuring that Solomon has everything necessary to carry out God's vision. David isn't just handing over plans, he's providing the means to make the vision a reality, and David doesn't stop there. He gives Solomon every division and duty: the priests, the Levites, the musicians, the gatekeepers, even the craftsmen and the leaders of the people. Everything is organized and delegated. It's like David is saying, "Son, here's the entire operation from A to Z. These are the people, these are the roles, these are the materials, these are the plans. Now it's up to you to step in and lead, to take what God has given and make it come alive." And you can almost feel the weight of responsibility on Solomon's shoulders. He's young, inexperienced, but fully equipped by his father and guided by God's Spirit. David also encourages Solomon to be strong and courageous. He repeats it several times. Be strong, be of good courage, do it. Don't be afraid or dismayed, for the Lord God, my God, will be with you. He won't leave you or forsake you until the work is finished. And that's not just pep talk, it's spiritual assurance that the work is not only monumental, but also divinely supported. It's a beautiful mix of fatherly guidance and divine promise, a combination of love, mentorship, and faith. And here's a point I find fascinating. David is very transparent about the spiritual and practical aspects of building the temple. It's not just bricks and mortar, it's about worship, service, and devotion. Every detail, from materials to personnel, is meant to honor God. He's teaching Solomon that leading isn't just about managing resources or giving orders. It's about aligning everything with God's will. The temple is a sacred project, and David ensures that Solomon understands both the vision and the practical steps to achieve it. Now, let's talk about the significance of this handoff. Spiritually, it shows that God works through generations. David had a heart for worship, for God's house, and for organizing his people. Solomon inherits not only the throne, but also a template for worship and leadership, a structure that's both spiritual and operational. Practically, it's brilliant leadership, a well-laid plan, full resources, trained personnel, and clear guidance. Solomon doesn't have to start from scratch. He steps into a system that's already in motion, guided by God's Spirit and David's preparation. And I love imagining this moment. David, standing before the assembly, handing over not just gold and silver, but blueprints, instructions, and blessings. Solomon, probably a little nervous, a little awed, receiving everything. The leaders of Israel witnessing this transition, understanding that God's plan is unfolding. It's ceremonial, strategic, and deeply spiritual all at once. You can almost hear the collective exhale, the sense of anticipation and reverence. What's more, this isn't just about building a physical temple, it's about creating a center for worship, for the people to encounter God. Every detail, from the materials to the assignments of priests and Levites, is infused with purpose. David's care shows that leadership isn't just about authority, it's about preparing others, mentoring, and ensuring that God's work continues beyond your own lifetime. He's passing on a legacy that's practical, spiritual, and deeply rooted in faith. So, in the end, this handoff is monumental. It's a mix of fatherly love, spiritual mentorship, divine guidance, and practical management. David set Solomon up for success by providing the plans, the resources, the people, and the encouragement to step into his God-given role. And it's a lesson for all of us. Leadership, faith, and preparation go hand in hand. You plan, you equip, you mentor, and you trust God to guide the process. And when it's done well, the work continues. God is honored, and the vision is fulfilled. All right, now we're getting into the closing chapters of David's life. And this part is really moving. You can picture him in his older years, knowing that his time is drawing to a close. And yet he's still focused on God's work and the future of Israel. He's not sitting back just because he's aging. He's making sure that the transition of power to Solomon is smooth and that the temple plans and resources he's gathered are fully in place. It's kind of amazing to see a leader thinking ahead like this, especially knowing that the future of an entire kingdom and the spiritual life of the people depends on what he does in these last days. So David calls together all the leaders, the mighty men, the officers of the tribes, the captains of thousands and hundreds, and even the stewards over the king's possessions. And he gives this speech that's part exhortation, part spiritual instruction, and part fatherly advice. He reminds everyone that although he wanted to build a temple for the Lord, God had said he wouldn't because of the bloodshed in his life, but God had chosen Solomon to carry on the work and build the temple. And he stresses that Solomon is young, inexperienced, but chosen by God. So David encourages him, tells him to be strong, to be courageous, and that the Lord will be with him. Can you imagine being Solomon in that moment? Young, probably a little nervous, but now fully equipped and supported by both God and your father. That's a lot of pressure, but also a huge privilege. And David doesn't just hand over verbal encouragement. He's meticulous. He gives Solomon all the temple plans, blueprints for every room, treasury, and sacred space, and all the gold, silver, and bronze needed for construction. He's literally passing on the complete vision, resources, and people to make it happen. It's amazing to see how practical and spiritual things are woven together here. It's like saying, son, here's the vision, here's the blueprint, here's the team, here's the treasure. Now go and fulfill God's plan. And here's where it gets really impressive. The people themselves step up. The leaders of the tribes, the captains, the officers, they all willingly give offerings for the temple. The numbers are staggering. 5,000 talents of gold, 10,000 talents of silver, 18,000 talents of bronze, and 100,000 talents of iron. And that's not even mentioning the precious stones that were given. But these gifts weren't forced. They were heartfelt offerings. People understood God's plan and wanted to be part of it. It's a powerful reminder that God works through people's hearts. When God puts a vision in motion, people respond, not because they have to, but because they want to participate in something bigger than themselves. And you can picture David watching all of this, seeing the generosity and devotion of the people. It must have been deeply moving for him. Then comes the anointing. Solomon is officially made king in a proper ceremonial way. You might recall that he had been anointed earlier under urgent circumstances when his brother Adonijah tried to make a grab for the throne. But now everything is formalized. There's a feast, sacrifices, and the people's acknowledgement of God's choice. Solomon takes the throne as king, and all the leaders, the mighty men, and even the sons of David submit to his authority. It's a smooth transition, which is remarkable considering the political complexities of the time. David ensured there would be no chaos, no civil war, and once again, we see the hand of God in orchestrating this moment, as well as David's wise leadership in preparing the people for this handoff. But beyond the ceremonies and the logistics, there's a deeper, reflective side to David here. In the midst of all these accomplishments, he reflects on life, on sin, and on the brevity of our days. He reminds the people and himself that our lives are fleeting. James 4:14 describes life as a mist that appears for a moment and then vanishes. And David's words echo this truth. He's been through victories and defeats, joys and failures, sins and redemption. He's faced consequences, like the tragedy surrounding Bathsheba and the rebellion of Absalom. And he's experienced the fleeting nature of earthly power and possessions. And yet through all of it, he remains focused on God, on faithfulness, and on leaving a legacy that aligns with God's will. David's reflection is deeply human. He knows he can't take his wealth or power with him, just like we can't. And he sees that life is short, which makes the work of God and the faithful use of our time all the more urgent. He celebrates the willingness of the people to give for the temple, acknowledging that these acts come from God's hand and heart, and he models gratitude, stewardship, and recognition of God's sovereignty. It's a lesson that resonates today. Generosity, service, and devotion are about aligning our hearts with God's purposes, understanding that our time and resources are ultimately his. And you can imagine the scene, the assembly, the feasts, the sacrifices, the joy of the people, and David's final words of blessing and exhortation. He encourages Solomon, gives him guidance, imparts wisdom, and reinforces God's presence and promise. David's last days are not about winding down, but about ensuring continuity, spiritual growth, and faithful leadership. It's a masterclass in legacy and preparation, showing how one can lead with both heart and wisdom until the very end. So, in this final phase, we see a mix of celebration, solemnity, and reflection. David hands over power with wisdom and care. The people respond with generosity and devotion, and the spiritual and practical aspects of God's plan are firmly in place. The anointing of Solomon, the smooth handoff, and the heartfelt offerings all highlight God's faithfulness, human generosity, and the importance of living with awareness of our time here on earth. David's reflections on life, sin, and the fleeting nature of existence remind us that our days are limited, that our actions matter, and that our hearts should be aligned with God's purposes. It's a deeply moving, inspiring, and practical conclusion to a life that shaped the course of Israel and prepared the way for God's ongoing work through Solomon. Alright, so now we get to one of my favorite parts, David's praise at the end of 2 Chronicles. This is the part where you really feel the heart of the man. After all the planning, organizing, giving instructions to Solomon, the handoff of resources, the anointing, and the sacrifices, David steps back and just worships God. And it's beautiful because it's not just formal or ceremonial, it's heartfelt, genuine, and human. You can almost hear him speaking directly to the people, but also in a very intimate conversation with God. David starts by acknowledging God as our Father. Now, that might sound simple, but it's actually monumental. This is one of the first times in the Bible where God is referred to in this parental, intimate way. Think about it. For generations, I remember people had a more distant, formal view of God. King of kings, judge, warrior, provider. And now David calls him Father. It's a personal relationship, a recognition that God isn't just the ruler over everything, he's intimately involved in our lives. And David's pointing out that relationship here is so relatable, right? Because it reminds us that we aren't just part of some cosmic bureaucracy, we are cared for, known, and loved. It's God's personal attention and guidance. And David is celebrating that. Then he moves into acknowledging God's greatness and power. He talks about how everything in heaven and on earth belongs to God, how power, victory, and majesty are his. And when I read that, I can almost picture David standing there, lifting his hands, gazing up, just overwhelmed by the sheer scope of God's sovereignty. It's like, wow, the God I serve isn't just the God of Israel, he's the God of the entire universe. And that perspective is important because it reminds us that while we're dealing with our daily stresses, our personal worries, God's hand is over everything. It's bigger than our problems, bigger than our plans, bigger than anything we might get hung up on. And here's the thing, David doesn't just praise God for power and majesty, he also acknowledges God as the provider of all things, including honor, riches, strength, and all that we need. He's pointing out that everything we have is a gift, that our abilities, our resources, our talents, all of it comes from God. And then he does this beautiful thing. He shifts it from God's greatness to a reflection on humanity. He says, essentially, but who am I and who are my people that we should be able to give so willingly? And this humility is striking. David realizes that it's not by his own might, his own planning, or his own giving that the temple is funded, but by God's provision. Everything belongs to God, and what we have is really his to begin with. We're stewards, not owners. And here's where it gets really personal and practical. David reminds the people that we are aliens and pilgrims here on earth. That phrase, aliens and pilgrims, it's such a vivid image. It's like saying, hey, this isn't your permanent home. You're just passing through. And that's a perspective that's so needed. How often do we get so caught up in the daily grind, in bills, careers, social status, or even hobbies, that we forget life is temporary? David's telling the people, remember, this isn't it. This is a journey. Life is short, fleeting, and we're meant to focus on what really matters. And that ties beautifully into the concept of stewardship we just talked about. If life is fleeting and everything we have comes from God, then how we live, give, and serve really matters. And David even makes this tangible. He talks about preparing abundant offerings for the temple and seeing the people give willingly. You can imagine him watching, maybe even smiling, seeing men and women offering treasures, materials, and resources not out of obligation, but because their hearts were aligned with God. That's the key. It's heart-driven, not rule-driven. God works through people's hearts. When people see the vision, when they understand the purpose, generosity naturally flows, and David celebrates that because it's a confirmation that God's work is alive, active, and moving through the community. Then David brings it back to reflection on life. He talks about the brevity of our days, about how quickly life passes, how fragile it is. He even gives examples. Our time here is like a shadow, like a mist that appears for a moment and then vanishes. And you know, it hits hard because it's true. He's not sugarcoating it. Life is short. And that makes every choice, every act of worship, every moment of generosity, every step in faith that much more significant. It's a call to live intentionally, to focus on what matters eternally, and to keep our priorities straight. And it's relatable because we all feel the pressure of time. We all know life is temporary, and hearing David put it so plainly makes it resonate. And then he prays for Solomon, asking God to give him a loyal heart to follow God's commandments, to live rightly, and to fulfill the plans for the temple. This is a beautiful example of intergenerational faith. David knows his life is nearing its end, and he's intentionally lifting up his son, ensuring the next generation is spiritually equipped. It's a reminder for us that our legacy isn't just material or professional, it's spiritual, relational, and about equipping those who come after us to continue God's work. David's praise continues with gratitude for the people's willingness to give. He notes that their hearts were upright, that they offered willingly, and that God takes pleasure in upright hearts. And this is such a valuable lesson. The heart matters more than the quantity. Sure, the numbers are huge. 5,000 talents of gold, 10,000 talents of silver, tons of bronze and iron, and precious stones. But David emphasizes that the attitude behind the gift is what counts. God looks at the heart. And isn't that comforting? Because it reminds us that even when we feel our contribution is small, when it comes from a genuine place of devotion and love, it matters in God's eyes. Then there's the moment of communal worship. The assembly bows, sacrifices are offered, feasts are shared, and Solomon is officially anointed. You can imagine the joy, the reverence, and the sense of continuity. David has done his part. Solomon now steps into his God-given role. The people are engaged, invested, and inspired. And in the midst of this, David's reflections on human frailty, divine greatness, generosity, and the fleeting nature of life come full circle. He's created a space where worship, devotion, planning, and reflection all intersect. David's words remind us that life is fleeting, that our days are limited, and that we should live for God. We are aliens and pilgrims here, just passing through, and we have one life to live. How we spend it, how we serve, how we give, and how we live out our faith. It all matters. And this is inspiring because it's deeply human. David wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. He sinned, and he faced consequences. Yet he still glorified God, led the people, and prepared the next generation. His life is a model of reflection, humility, and devotion. And here's the beauty of it. It's relatable. We all have limited time. We all have responsibilities, families, careers, and daily tasks. We're all navigating life in a world that can feel temporary and unstable. And yet, like David, we can focus on what matters, invest in the spiritual well-being of those around us, and live with intentionality. We can praise God, recognize His greatness, steward our resources, and serve with our hearts aligned to His purposes. David's closing words are not just historical, they're practical guidance for living faithfully, for appreciating the brevity of life, and for aligning ourselves with God's eternal plans. So, as we wrap up, we see David's final praise as a perfect blend of personal reflection, corporate worship, and spiritual instruction. He recognizes God as Father, celebrates His greatness, reminds the people and us of life's fleeting nature, and calls everyone to live purposefully for God. It's inspiring, deeply human, and profoundly applicable. The message is clear. Life is short. God is great, our hearts matter, and our day should be lived with intentional devotion, service, and faith. And that, in essence, is the beauty and power of David's final words in 2 Chronicles. They resonate across generations, reminding us to live for God, steward what we've been given, and remember that we're just passing through this world as aliens and pilgrims, with eternity in mind. So, as we wrap this up, take a moment to reflect on David's life, the victories, the mistakes, and his unwavering heart for God. Life is short, and we're just passing through. So let's live intentionally, align our hearts with God, and make the most of the time we have. There's so much more to learn and discover, so stay curious, stay engaged, and embrace the journey of faith. Every step matters, and God's guidance is always with us.